Hidden deep in Afghanistan's Kunar province lies a valley shrouded in fog, a place where every army that entered vanished without a trace. Soviet patrols, British expeditions. Now, even the U.S. Army has faced its horrors. In this episode of Battlefield Secrets, we uncover the chilling story of the Black Valley, where shadows move on their own, whispers repeat the last words of the dead, and soldiers are consumed by a force no one can explain. Stay with us, because what you're about to hear is not just history. It's a nightmare that keeps replaying itself. The report begins without embellishment. Arrival, Kunar Province, eastern Afghanistan. A convoy of armored vehicles descends a narrow, switchback road, engines echoing against stone. The light is brittle, silvered by dust. Beyond the ridge lies the valley, a seam of darkness between serrated mountains. From above, it looks like a scar carved through the earth. Local maps label it only as Darcia, the Black Valley. The troops dismount methodically, their movements efficient, almost ceremonial. Gear checks, radio tests, perimeter sweeps. The air is unnaturally still, muffling every sound. Even the wind seems to hesitate before crossing the valley mouth. The soldiers speak in low tones, their words flattened by the landscape. Nearby, a small group of villagers watches from a distance, faces half veiled by scarves, expressions unreadable. An interpreter approaches them with practiced diplomacy. The oldest among them, a man with a carved wooden cane, steps forward. His voice is low, his dialect aged by isolation. The interpreter hesitates before translating. He says the valley is old, older than any map, older than memory. The elder gestures toward the descending fog. Every army that walks there vanishes. The comment is dismissed quietly. Superstition, they assume. The soldiers return to their preparations. Yet, the detail remains. Soviet patrols once entered this same valley during the 1980s, searching for insurgent routes along the Kunar River. None returned intact. Later, British archives mentioned similar losses during earlier frontier skirmishes. The terrain devours more than men. It swallows their records, their explanations, their logic. The geography is severe. High ridges collapse into deep ravines, with dry riverbeds twisting like veins. Satellite images show minimal vegetation, only skeletal shrubs and scattered rocks scorched black by time. It is the kind of landscape that seems older than human memory, resistant to comprehension, indifferent to progress. Fog collects here even when the rest of the province remains clear, forming a static mist that thickens at dusk and dissolves by dawn. In the base's temporary operations tent, the commanding officer reviews topographical data. The reports are clinical: low visibility zones, potential ambush sites, thermal irregularities. None mention folklore. The valley, on paper, is only terrain. But outside, the villagers remain, silent against the descending night. The oldest woman among them draws a line in the dust with her finger, a crude map of the valley. She circles its center once, then covers it with her palm. The gesture requires no translation. At 6:47 p.m., the first wind moves through the camp. It carries with it a faint odor, not of decay, but of cold metal and distant rain. Soldiers pause briefly, sensing a shift in temperature. The fog, once settled low across the valley floor, begins to lift, rolling against gravity, as though exhaling from beneath the earth. Flashlights cut through the mist, their beams short-lived and pale. The commander gives the order to proceed with the next day's reconnaissance. For now, they wait. The fog thickens until it obscures the entire valley mouth, sealing it like a wound. Beyond it, shapes move, perhaps smoke, perhaps nothing. The interpreter looks toward the darkness where the elder once stood. The villagers have already gone, leaving only shallow footprints that vanish halfway down the road. The official record notes the night as uneventful. No contact, no movement, no engagement. Yet the sensors logged something else, a faint vibration, rhythmic and continuous, just before the fog reached the first outpost. The patrol never noticed that the valley moved first. The entry began at sunset. Officially logged as a routine terrain reconnaissance, the patrol consisted of 9 personnel moving in staggered formation along the western slope of the valley. Visibility was recorded as limited but manageable. Within minutes, that entry became inaccurate. The fog had not receded overnight. Instead, it accumulated in layers, shifting like underwater silt. Its density rendered all depth perception unreliable. The valley's walls seemed to fold inward, narrowing until the soldiers appeared to move through a corridor carved from vapor. Radio communication remained functional at short range, but carried an audible distortion, a low-frequency pulse that repeated every few seconds. GPS units blinked erratically. Coordinates duplicated, vanished, then reappeared with altered elevation values. The compasses rotated in slow, deliberate circles. One soldier tapped the casing against his rifle stock. The needle kept turning. Command instructed them to rely on visual markers, but soon there were none, only shapes of rock, blurred by moisture and fading light. The valley floor was uneven, scored by trenches from past conflicts. Some appeared natural, others the remnants of dugouts and collapsed bunkers. The ground gave off a faint mineral odor, mixed with something organic, damp earth and distant rot. The fog muted the world to grayscale. Even their uniforms lost color. The soldiers became silhouettes within a dissolving landscape. Sound did not carry as it should have. Steps were muffled, voices reduced to faint vibrations. When one soldier spoke, the reply seemed delayed, arriving from a different angle than expected. Above them, the sky had vanished. Only the faint reflection of dying sunlight remained, trapped within the mist like light beneath ice. The mission log noted initial disorientation, followed by a gradual collective unease. There was no specific trigger. It was not fear, exactly, but the sense of being studied from every direction. Each time the fog shifted, it revealed nothing, yet the perception of nearness persisted. The air felt heavier, damp enough to bead along their gear. Topographical reference charts provided little clarity. The maps, drawn decades earlier during Soviet occupation, listed several landmarks, rock formations, dry streams, and abandoned observation posts. None were visible. Even thermal scans failed to delineate the valley's contours. The technology recorded only the patrol itself, enclosed by ambient cold. At 7:26 p.m., the first instrument anomaly occurred. The environmental sensor reported a sudden rise in humidity, followed by a distinct rhythmic fluctuation. At first, the data appeared corrupted, irregular spikes, spaced too evenly to represent wind or natural pressure changes. A recalibration confirmed the pattern. The device was detecting respiration. The operator repeated the scan at 3-meter intervals. Each reading yielded the same result: multiple breathing signatures surrounding the unit, positioned at an estimated radius of 5 meters. There was no visible presence, no movement in the fog. The temperature remained stable. The readings were verified on a secondary device, which produced identical data. The commanding officer ordered a full perimeter check. Soldiers advanced cautiously, scanning every direction with infrared optics. The results showed only ambient haze, yet the rhythm continued. In, out, as though the valley itself inhaled. The audio recorder, later reviewed, captured a faint sound beneath the static, low, soft, and unmistakably human. When the final data entry for the hour was filed, it read, visibility, nil. Terrain, unstable. Instruments, unreliable. Ambient audio, contains pattern consistent with respiration, non-localized. No further explanation was offered. The fog pressed closer, swallowing the valley whole. Somewhere behind them, shadows shifted, slow, deliberate, indifferent to light. The fog did not lift. By late morning, it had thickened into a uniform sheet that diffused all light, turning the valley's interior into a monochrome void. The patrol advanced cautiously, following a narrow defile that appeared to have once served as a military path. Its walls bore the marks of excavation, hand tools, not erosion, evidence of prior occupation. At 10:42 a.m., the forward observer identified metallic debris partially buried in silt. The team halted to investigate. Excavation revealed fragments of oxidized equipment, ammunition boxes, canteens, torn fabric, and a corroded rifle barrel. Stamped along its receiver, beneath layers of rust, was a partially legible inscription in Cyrillic. The identification confirmed Soviet origin, circa early 1980s. The valley had once hosted multiple Soviet incursions during the Kunar campaigns, Reconnaissance and counterinsurgent operations recorded between 1982 and 1986. Few had returned intact. Official reports cited ambushes and terrain collapse, though recovery teams noted the absence of remains. What the Americans found mirrored those accounts: burned-out structures, skeletal framework of a forward operating camp, and scattered personal artifacts fused into the soil. In one crater, the remnants of a tent were fused with blackened stone, as if melted by extreme heat. The ground underfoot had hardened into a glassy surface. The smell of oxidized iron hung in the mist. Scattered nearby were pages from a Soviet-issue field manual, their ink dissolved into gray stains. Only fragments of writing remained, the Cyrillic letters bleeding into the paper. Dust, breath, night. The discovery of personal effects drew further examination. A soldier uncovered a canteen still sealed, its surface blistered by heat. Another located an enamel cup filled with compacted ash. The fog collected moisture on every surface, making the remains appear recent, as if the fire had only just gone out. Further along the ridge, they found carved inscriptions on the rock face. Words scratched hastily, sometimes overlapping. Many were dates. Others incomplete sentences. We went below, no one returns. The carvings grew more erratic deeper into the pass, the strokes gouged rather than written. The documentation officer recorded each finding with procedural precision. Coordinates, measurements, atmospheric data. Every entry factual, sterile. Yet the silence of the valley made the routine unsettling. The absence of insects, birds, or echo created a sensation of distance collapsing inward, as though the sound itself refused to exist here. At 11:03 a.m., thermal imaging was initiated to establish environmental baselines. Initial readings were consistent with ambient temperature, approximately 6 degrees Celsius. However, subsequent sweeps detected localized heat signatures scattered across the site. The readings fluctuated, faint but consistent with human-scale thermal profiles. Visual inspection showed nothing. The fog remained motionless. Sensors indicated stationary sources, each roughly the size and temperature of a living body. When one soldier approached a heat point, the signal faded, vanishing entirely, only to reappear a few meters away. The process repeated multiple times. Audio recording devices captured low-frequency disturbances concurrent with each temperature fluctuation. Upon playback, the sounds resembled faint murmurs. Linguistic analysis later identified fragmented syllables, indistinct, yet rhythmic enough to mimic names. The report concludes with the notation, thermal variance persists. No visual confirmation. Fog density increasing. Audible anomalies correspond to sensor readings. Personnel accounted for 9. The final observation before withdrawal was not entered into the log. Several soldiers claimed to hear their own names spoken quietly from within the mist. Each one returned to them with precise pronunciation, as if repeated by a voice that had been waiting for years to remember. By afternoon, the fog had condensed into something more tangible than air, a pale density that resisted movement. Each breath carried moisture heavy enough to feel like weight. Visibility dropped below 2 meters. The patrol advanced in near silence, not from discipline, but because sound no longer traveled as expected. Footsteps no longer matched the rhythm of walking. Each impact on the soil produced a delayed echo, as though the valley required additional time to acknowledge motion. The auditory lag created confusion among the ranks. Voices returned distorted, lower in pitch, sometimes repeating after the speaker had gone quiet. The phenomenon resembled battlefield disorientation known from historical reports. Sensory inversion observed among soldiers during prolonged exposure to low-visibility combat zones. Yet this was different. It was not fatigue, nor acoustics. The delay was selective, intelligent in its timing. At 2:17 p.m., environmental readings confirmed an unusual barometric fluctuation. The air pressure increased abruptly, not from weather shifts, but as if the valley were inhaling. Fog pressed inward in visible waves. The light flattened completely, no gradients, no shadows, only gray saturation. Then, within seconds, shadows returned. At first they appeared normal, cast faintly beneath the soldiers. But soon, discrepancies emerged. One soldier's shadow bent in the wrong direction, another extended farther than his body's position allowed. When the men stopped moving, the shadows did not. They continued walking, a few paces delayed, then paused, catching up with their owners. The behavior repeated several times before the commanding officer ordered all personnel to remain still. Even in stillness, the shadows stirred. The visual disturbance could not be verified through camera feeds. Optical recordings displayed static, white interference resembling old film degradation. Frame analysis conducted later revealed that the interference itself seemed to mimic movement, ghostly silhouettes flickering at the edge of each image. The fog had rendered all digital lenses unreliable, leaving only direct observation. Reports of disorientation increased. Several soldiers described a distortion in perception, as though time within the valley no longer aligned with their actions. One attempted to raise his hand, but saw the motion occur seconds later. Another described hearing his own voice answer before he spoke. The effect produced measurable physiological stress, irregular breathing, elevated pulse, erratic focus. The documentation officer, maintaining procedural tone, continued recording atmospheric data. His log described the sensation of being inside a closed system, no echo, no external resonance. He noted that the environment behaved as though conscious of intrusion. Each sound seemed absorbed, evaluated, then returned altered, quieter, almost contemplative. At 3:02 p.m., an incident occurred. The unit formed a defensive circle while recalibrating their equipment. One soldier, positioned near the rear flank, turned to adjust a thermal scanner. Observers noted that his shadow extended behind him, elongated across the mist-damp ground. When he shifted his stance, the shadow did not. It remained upright. He called out, twice, but no one heard a response until the third attempt, delayed, faint, as if carried through layers of water. The fog thickened suddenly, obscuring him from view. Infrared showed no anomaly, only static. Within seconds, the space he had occupied was empty. When visibility returned, his equipment lay on the ground. His boot prints stopped mid-stride. His shadow, however, persisted, a dark imprint shaped perfectly to his outline, burned faintly into the soil. The final log entry from that hour read, personnel count, 8. Visual anomaly, non-reflective silhouette consistent with human form, persisting despite absence of subject. After that notation, the recorder's microphone picked up one final, indistinct sound, a slow inhalation, deep and deliberate, coming not from any direction but from the valley itself, as if the land had decided to breathe. The valley no longer resembled its mapped form. Coordinates ceased to correspond with any recorded topography. Compass needles turned without resistance, spinning silently in their housings. GPS receivers displayed blank grids, their digital overlays fading into static. The patrol's movements, once tracked on synchronized devices, became unreadable. Positions shifted erratically, as if the earth beneath them were reconfiguring its own dimensions. At 4:10 p.m., the commanding officer ordered a tactical withdrawal toward the original entry point. Bearings were established visually, aligned with ridge contours recorded earlier. Yet after 20 minutes of movement, the team emerged into terrain identical to the one they had departed. Same rock formations, same broken Soviet radio tower half buried in soil. The distance covered, approximately 800 meters by odometer, had returned them to the same coordinates. Topographical dissonance was not unprecedented in military archives. Historical data from both Soviet and British operations in Afghanistan noted instances of terrain repetition, regions where navigation instruments faltered and patrols reported looping paths. Analysts attributed the phenomenon to magnetic mineral deposits or environmental mirages produced by extreme temperature contrasts. But the conditions in Kunar did not match those explanations. There was no heat shimmer, no magnetic interference field large enough to distort geography on this scale. The fog's density now made it almost physical. It clung to fabric and skin, forming droplets that refracted the little light remaining. The soldiers moved as though underwater, sound dampened to near silence. Every breath came with visible condensation. Every movement displaced a faint current through the mist. The valley responded. Its air seemed to close behind them, erasing their passage. Attempts to mark their route with infrared flares failed. The lights disappeared within seconds, their glow absorbed. The path ahead appeared identical to the path behind. Even foot impressions dissolved as soon as the unit advanced. It was as if the valley refused to retain memory of intrusion. At 4:42 p.m., they detected movement through the haze, silhouettes advancing in parallel formation. Weapons were raised, identification protocols issued. No response came. The shapes continued at a steady pace, their outlines distorted, uniforms unfamiliar. For a moment, the observers believed they were seeing their own reflections, refracted through layers of fog. Then one of the figures turned its head, revealing the faded insignia of a Soviet field uniform. The encounter lasted less than a minute. The shapes passed silently through the mist and dissolved into the gray distance. No thermal readings registered. Cameras recorded only static interference, intercut with faint distortions resembling human outlines. The patrol continued in silence, no one speaking of what they had seen. At 5:05 p.m., radio contact with the command post degraded into looping fragments, phrases repeating without source. The transmissions contained voices identifiable as those of their own unit, repeating lines spoken minutes earlier. One recording played back an instruction the commanding officer had not yet given. When he finally spoke it aloud, the transmission stopped. The incident resembled documented auditory mirroring observed during combat stress, where perception anticipates future stimuli. However, the recordings verified otherwise. Each echo carried unique distortion, layered with frequencies inconsistent with the unit's equipment. At 5:29 p.m., the valley's topography shifted again. The slope beneath them leveled out, revealing an open expanse that did not exist on any map. In the distance, faint lights appeared, flickering, erratic, like campfires seen through rain. The unit approached cautiously. As they drew nearer, the lights blinked out, one by one, until darkness reclaimed the field. Then, through the static of malfunctioning radios, came the unmistakable sound of breathing, slow, synchronized, multiplied across all channels. A voice followed, faint but precise, speaking in perfect English. "Do you read? You're already here." The valley held its breath again, and the transmission ended. By evening, the fog had changed in character. It no longer smelled of moisture and stone, but of combustion. The air carried a chemical residue, burnt wood, cordite, and charred fabric. The odor registered instantly recognizable to the soldiers, though no fires burned nearby. Environmental sensors confirmed trace particulates consistent with incomplete gunpowder ignition, yet thermal scans indicated no heat source within measurable range. At 6:12 p.m., the documentation officer noted persistent olfactory presence, acrid, artificial, resembling post-combat residue. The scent was strongest in the depressions between ridges, where the fog settled into still pools. Visibility dropped further. Even flashlights revealed only brief tunnels of illumination before fading into opaque gray. The atmosphere induced confusion. Several soldiers reported vertigo, claiming the terrain appeared to ripple beneath their feet. One described hearing the metallic rattle of spent casings falling onto stone, though none were present. Another swore the valley walls bore scorch marks that vanished when approached. The command log identified these as hallucinatory echoes, likely triggered by sensory overload and environmental deprivation. Yet, among the archives, similar phenomena were documented. Soviet reports from 1983 referenced phantom engagements, auditory illusions of battle noise occurring during extended fog cover. Earlier British field notes from the late 19th century described the Valley of Gunsmoke, where patrols claimed to smell battle long after it had ended. These accounts had been dismissed as psychological artifacts, yet the resemblance was exact. At 6:40 p.m., the first visual distortion occurred. Through the haze, one soldier spotted figures moving across an embankment. They advanced in staggered lines, carrying rifles whose bayonets caught dim light. Their uniforms were dark, their posture deliberate. As the observer raised his weapon, his targeting scope showed the same terrain devoid of life. When he lowered the scope, the figures were visible again, marching through fog dense enough to obscure their faces. Simultaneously, faint noises began to layer over the silence. The dull rhythm of distant artillery, indistinct shouting, the whistle of incoming shells. The fog reacted to the sounds, pulsing slightly with each imagined impact. Visibility broke apart into flashes, shadows sprinting, collapsing, rising again. The valley became an archive replaying its own violence. A soldier stumbled forward, shouting into the mist, demanding identification. His voice was absorbed almost instantly. The sounds of combat continued around him, yet no projectile struck, no impact registered. The team regrouped, weapons drawn, surrounded by motion that never touched them. Then came the voices, hundreds, speaking at once. Some pleaded for water, others for ammunition, others repeating unintelligible commands in Russian, Pashto, and archaic English dialects from older conflicts. The radio feeds filled with layered transmissions, fragments of distress calls, coordinates, and death reports from long-expired frequencies. Attempts to isolate the source failed. The voices were omnidirectional, emanating from fog rather than air. At 7:03 p.m., one soldier broke formation and approached the slope. He claimed to recognize a pattern in the chaos, an image that felt familiar. The others followed at a distance. Through the vapor, they saw what appeared to be a man kneeling beside a collapsed bunker. His uniform, though obscured, bore Soviet insignia. The man's posture was unervingly familiar. Same height, same build as the approaching soldier. When the fog thinned for a moment, the scene clarified. The man was him, the same face beneath a Soviet helmet, streaked with soot, a wound visible across the chest. The soldier froze. His counterpart looked up slowly, eyes reflecting dull light. Then the image ignited, not in flame, but in distortion, and vanished. The official record concluded with one final notation: olfactory readings unchanged. Atmospheric particulates increasing. Personnel condition unstable. Visual confirmation inconclusive. Subject reports seeing self in prior uniform configuration. Duration 4.7 seconds. After that, the smell of smoke intensified until breathing felt like inhaling through a spent cartridge. Somewhere in the fog, unseen voices continued to beg for help, in languages no one alive could translate. At 7:45 p.m., all radio transmissions ceased. The signal breakdown was abrupt, unaccompanied by static or interference, only silence. Every attempt to re-establish contact, through shortwave and encrypted long-range frequencies, produced the same void. Even the background hum of electrical current was gone. The communications officer described it as a complete absence of atmosphere, as though sound itself had been extracted. The valley responded by growing stiller. Fog rolled over the ground in slow, steady waves, blanketing the remaining soldiers in an illusion of stasis. The air temperature dropped by several degrees. Condensation formed along their rifles and helmets, each droplet trembling but never falling. The silence pressed against them with physical density, thick, absolute, intrusive. No animal calls were recorded. No wind passed through the trenches. Even movement produced no true sound, only the faint scrape of boots against grit, quickly absorbed. The absence was total. In archival terminology, this would later be classified as an acoustic dead zone, a phenomenon occasionally observed during mountain engagements, where topography disrupts echo and atmospheric reflection. But this silence extended beyond physics. It did not distort sound, it consumed it. The documentation officer noted, auditory field, null. Ambient noise, nil. Personnel auditory strain increasing. Perceived weight in air. As night advanced, fog density increased. Visibility decreased to less than 1 meter. The soldiers spoke in low tones to preserve orientation, but their words dissolved into whispers, fading halfway between mouth and ear. One soldier reported hearing his own voice spoken back to him seconds later, not as an echo, but as repetition, matching his tone precisely. Another described hearing someone breathe beside him when no one stood there. At 8:10 p.m., the communications specialist initiated a hardware diagnostic, linking the environmental sensors to internal feedback loops. The devices registered ambient fluctuations inconsistent with silence, faint, rhythmic pulses repeating every 4 seconds. When converted into audible form, the sound resembled breathing. The data suggested the presence of 12 distinct respiration signatures. The unit contained only 8 personnel. A secondary scan confirmed the readings. The unknown signatures surrounded the team, stationary but close, within 5 meters. Infrared imaging remained blank. The fog absorbed all thermal differentiation, leaving only the sensation of unseen proximity. Historical precedents were referenced in the mission log. Reports from Soviet divisions in 1984 described entire platoons vanishing after radio blackouts, followed by accounts of phantom personnel appearing on motion sensors. NATO documentation during later mountain operations noted temporary duplications of unit signatures, typically explained as electronic ghosting. Yet those occurrences coincided with electrical storms or magnetic interference. Here, there was no weather, no current, no sound. Only breath. At 8:26 p.m., the first scream was heard, thin, distant, metallic. Its source could not be located. The sound carried through the fog in a single sharp wave before dissolving. Seconds later, a whisper followed, low, drawn out, indecipherable. Then another. The fog vibrated faintly, as if transmitting words through its own texture. The soldiers formed a perimeter. Flashlights cut pale tunnels through the mist, revealing only the gleam of wet stone and glistening steel. Their shadows bent unnaturally, as though reluctant to follow. A rhythmic pattern of footsteps began to echo from behind them, deliberate, heavy, too synchronized to belong to the group. The perimeter rotated, weapons trained toward the sound. No figures appeared. The steps continued, circling, then ceased abruptly. The silence returned, denser than before. The final log of the hour read, all communication silent. Sound distortion continues. Breathing sensors detect 12 presences. Personnel visible, 8. Unknown remainder unverified. Immediately after that entry, the motion detectors triggered again, registering slow, steady movement closing in from every direction. The log captured one final note before the feed cut out. Footsteps behind us. At 9 p.m., visual anomalies were first recorded across the valley floor. Through the thickening fog, faint outlines began to coalesce, linear formations, moving in silence. At first, the soldiers assumed it was an optical illusion, the mind imposing order on shifting mist. But the shapes persisted. They advanced in deliberate cadence, boots striking the invisible ground without producing sound. The figures formed a column. Their silhouettes revealed helmets, rifles, and packs. The details appeared inconsistent. Some carried long rifles with fixed bayonets, others the broader outlines of modern carbines. Uniform contours shifted from one era to another, as if time itself was compressed into the same space. Thermal readings remained null. The environment registered no change in temperature or movement. Yet visually, the fog distorted around the figures, creating faint refractions that suggested mass. Their formation extended across the valley, fading into the gray horizon. At 9:07 p.m., one soldier identified Cyrillic markings on a passing figure's helmet, faint white lettering that glowed momentarily before dissolving. Another shape wore the outline of a khaki field coat consistent with British colonial issue, circa 1878, matching records from the Second Anglo-Afghan War. Interspersed among them were indistinct outlines bearing American body armor, their posture familiar, yet motionless in transition. The valley appeared to contain every army that had ever entered it. No communication passed among the figures. Their march was constant and mechanical, heads bowed, weapons at the ready, though no battle awaited. Occasionally one would pause, turning its head fractionally toward the observing unit. The motion was deliberate, acknowledgement rather than reflex. The eyes, where visible, reflected no light. The documentation officer described them clinically. Phantom patrol formations detected, multiple nationalities, approximate strength indeterminate. Movement uniform, orientation west to east. No sound emission, no environmental displacement. Entities aware of observation. Attempts to illuminate the figures failed. Flashlights passed through them as though through vapor. Still, the soldiers reported a perceptible pressure when one of the figures crossed nearby. A sudden drop in temperature and a sensation of air compression, as if the atmosphere resisted their passage. Archival cross-reference revealed striking continuity. Soviet operations recorded similar sightings in 1985, reports of columns of men moving through mist without sound. Earlier British accounts from 1880 mentioned the Lost March, a procession seen from distance by survivors of the Pei-War Coastal Advance. Even local Afghan folklore described the valley as a place where the mountains keep their dead walking. At 9:29 p.m., the fog pulsed, and the procession stopped. The figures froze mid-step, weapons raised toward an unseen enemy. The entire valley seemed to hold its breath. The soldiers stood motionless, surrounded by a tableau of combat, spectral armies locked in positions of attack, as if time had been suspended mid-battle. One of the Americans, Private H, moved forward, drawn by proximity to a form kneeling beside a field radio. The figure's helmet bore faded red insignia, the paint flaking away. Its hand rested over the radio receiver, mouth open as if issuing an order that never finished. When Private H raised his flashlight, the beam caught the man's face. It was indistinct, blurred by mist, but the shape of the jaw, the contour of the cheek, were unmistakably his own. The soldier froze. The phantom raised its head slowly, matching his motion with exact precision, then flickered out. The surrounding formations began to dissolve, fragmenting like smoke disturbed by wind. The documentation log concluded, phenomenon duration, 28 minutes. Environmental impact, none. Residual temperature, decrease. Observers report familiarity with apparitions. Final notation, one soldier approached phantom image exhibiting identical features to his own. After the last entry, the fog reassembled, and for a brief moment, the sound of synchronized footsteps returned, marching into a horizon that no longer existed. At 10:12 p.m., the squad leader's radio activated spontaneously. No initiation command had been issued. The device emitted low-frequency static punctuated by clear phrases in English, distorted yet intelligible. The first transmission instructed, advance to Grid 16. North Ridge. Maintain formation. Coordinates corresponded to a topographic feature previously surveyed, though attempts to cross-check on GPS returned null readings. Subsequent messages followed. Their cadence was irregular, sometimes overlapping, each phrasing identical to directives found in Soviet operational archives. Reports from 1984 describe patrols ordered into ambush zones within Kunar province. Every unit vanished with no further contact. The phrasing, tone, and cadence matched exactly. One transmission contained a mispronounced Cyrillic phoneme, consistent with an operator whose mother tongue was Russian. The squad leader noted the phenomenon. Signal strength fluctuated wildly, oscillating between and complete loss in seconds. Frequency analysis revealed no identifiable source. Attempts to triangulate the origin produced coordinates within the valley itself, shifting as if the terrain were in motion. Personnel responded according to standard protocol, repeating back orders, confirming positions, preparing for movement. Each affirmation, however, triggered a new set of directives, increasingly hazardous, directing the squad toward precipitous ledges and steep ravines. Attempts to clarify intent failed. The radio repeated previous instructions regardless of acknowledgement. The fog thickened simultaneously, reflecting pulses of radio energy in undetectable wavelengths. Visual cues grew unreliable. Shadows of the soldiers lengthened, contracting inconsistently with light sources. The unit's psychological stability began to degrade. Doubt entered tactical communication. One soldier questioned whether the leader had misheard a command. Another hesitated, unsure if his path would lead to certain death. Archival review noted similar effects during extreme mountain operations. Commanded movements that contradicted terrain intelligence were documented in both Soviet and British engagements. Field reports described hallucinations and perceived authority distortion in units exposed to high-stress, low-visibility environments. In the present instance, environmental sensors measured no anomalies that could account for auditory distortion, yet electrostatic readings indicated low-level interference around all personnel. At 10:38 p.m., a junior soldier froze mid-step. His reflection appeared in the fog, a mirage that was impossibly three-dimensional. The image was older, scarred, with hollow eyes, the uniform faded and torn, mouth open in silent scream. Observers reported the phenomenon with precise measurements. Angle of observation 37 degrees, distance 4.2 meters, persistence 12 seconds. The reflection faded as abruptly as it appeared. The squad leader documented all observations, noting the procedural impossibility of the sequence. Radio commands match historical transmissions. Personnel confirmation fails to alter directives. Reflection anomaly observed. Environmental sensors normal. Terrain coordinates inconsistent with GPS and maps. The final transmission arrived at 10:44 p.m. It was neither fragmented nor delayed. The radio emitted a single, distinct phrase: "Captain moves forward." The path awaits. The squad leader's name, spoken clearly through static, reverberated across the valley. No human voice produced it. The fog itself seemed to pulse in response. The unit halted immediately. The command, though impossible, carried the same urgency and authority as any field order. Outside, the valley remained perfectly silent. Yet within the static and mist, the sound of his own name had already convinced the terrain to listen. At 11:15 p.m., the valley's fog had reached its maximum density. All environmental sensors confirmed near-zero visibility, steady humidity, and marginal temperature drop. Sound propagation was irregular. Low-frequency vibrations were recorded without source. The patrol's physiological readings indicated elevated stress. Heart rates exceeded 120 bpm, respiratory rates inconsistent with exertion, and galvanic skin response suggested extreme arousal. The documentation officer noted, personnel report indistinguishable sensory input. Visual and auditory stimuli cannot be verified. Psychological assessment, acute disorientation and high stress. Soldiers began to perceive events that could not be objectively confirmed. Apparitions of previous combat incidents appeared through the mist, flashes of men falling, rifles firing, smoke curling into the sky, all matching historical records of Soviet and Afghan engagements from the 1980s. No physical traces corroborated these events. Shadows exhibited anomalous behavior. Each soldier's shadow, cast faintly on the wet soil, detached gradually. They moved independently, mimicking a deliberate path different from the soldier's trajectory. The motion was subtle at first, a small lag behind the body, a slight shift toward ridge edges. Within minutes, the shadows had begun guiding the patrol, moving towards steep inclines and narrow ridges. Soldiers, following instinct or compulsion, often found themselves closer to the valley's precipitous edges. The psychological effect intensified as auditory hallucinations developed. Whispers emerged from the fog, indistinct but coherent in tone. Several soldiers reported hearing prior orders, pleas for help in multiple languages, and cries echoing their own names. Research notes in prior operational studies describe battlefield disorientation and fear conditioning, where sensory input can trigger false memories and perceived agency. The valley appeared to employ these mechanisms naturally, amplifying panic and compliance. At 11:42 p.m., one soldier screamed. The sound, captured on all audio devices, was reproduced seconds later by another voice, distorted, not matching any known vocal signature. The second scream aligned with the first in pitch and intensity, yet carried subtle tonal differences, producing the perception of two sources from one origin. Physiological sensors recorded spikes in adrenaline across multiple subjects during this moment. The patrol's cohesion deteriorated. Soldiers separated instinctively, each following shadows that moved with intent. Movement detectors indicated motion, yet visual confirmation remained impossible. Attempts to regroup were hampered by distorted perceptions of distance, orientation, and timing. One soldier, tracking his own shadow, miscalculated a step on a ridge, nearly slipping before instinctive grip corrected his fall. The valley reinforced the detachment of self from environment. Soldiers experienced brief, vivid reliving of past deaths from Soviet campaigns, ordnance explosions, ambushes, and collapsed positions. Each scene was temporally compressed, lasting seconds yet perceived as minutes. Observers, reviewing recordings, later noted that heart rate and respiration corresponded precisely to the relived event rather than actual exertion. At 11:57 p.m., one soldier halted. The fog in front of him pulsed faintly. From within, a voice spoke clearly, calm, deliberate, and unmistakable, his own. It repeated a phrase he had not yet spoken, an order he had considered minutes prior. Compelled by instinct, he responded verbally, addressing the fog. His words dissipated without echo. All devices recorded only static. The log entry concluded. Personnel experiencing dissociation of self and environment. Shadows autonomous. Auditory input contains self-referential signals. Compliance observed with independent shadow movement. Sensory verification impossible. Valley influences maximal. The final observation of the hour, the soldier's voice, answered by himself from within the fog, confirmed the valley's complete manipulation of perception. The distinction between reality and hallucination ceased to exist. At 12:38 a.m., the fog exhibited new visual anomalies. Faces began to emerge, faint, grayscale impressions within the dense mist. Their features were distinct: hollow eyes, gaunt cheeks, and expressions ranging from rigid discipline to silent horror. Thermal sensors registered no heat. Movement detectors recorded only the patrol's own motions. Observation notes classified these as non-physical visual phenomena. The faces varied in uniform and equipment, indicating multiple eras of conflict. Some wore Soviet field caps and tattered coats consistent with 1980s counter campaigns. Others bore British khaki, pith helmets, and cartridge belts characteristic of frontier operations from the late 19th century. A few carried the outlines of modern body armor, resembling the present-day unit. The officer recorded each as a separate observation, noting formation, angle of view, and apparent distance, generally between 3 and 12 meters from the soldiers. The fog's density caused each visage to fluctuate. Faces faded in and out of visibility, their features sharpening for brief moments before dissolving. Shadows behind them remained stable, yet did not correlate with any known light source. The documentation officer recorded: persistence, 5 seconds. No thermal or electromagnetic anomaly detected. Apparent gaze directed toward observing personnel. Silence dominated the valley, yet the soldiers reported subtle auditory cues, indistinct whispers of commands, muffled cries, and the faint metallic clang of rifles striking helmets. Historical cross-references confirmed that similar phenomena were noted in Soviet after-action reports from Kunar province, where patrols described faces in the mist, observing silently. Earlier British expedition logs recorded spectral sentinels appearing on ridges and in trench systems during fog-bound operations. At 12:52 a.m., a soldier observed his comrade's death twice. In the first instance, the man fell amid a spectral firefight, bullets traced in gray mist, his body collapsing over trench debris. Moments later, the same figure appeared in the present, standing near the patrol but struck identically by invisible fire. The duplication was precise, down to posture and weapon grip. No thermal anomaly corresponded to either incident. The observation officer noted: temporal overlay. Historical casualty coincides spatially with present unit. No physical substrate detected. Beyond individual figures, the fog began to assume structure. Trenches, shell craters, and foxholes appeared in grayscale relief, forming recognizable enemy defensive positions. The formations suggested coordinated defensive layouts, Soviet, British, and modern, yet no personnel occupied the spaces. Sensors recorded ground-level density, changes consistent with moisture, but no mass displacement. The valley seemed to reconstruct combat scenes across multiple timelines. As the patrol navigated through these ghostly landscapes, faces followed silently. Some appeared atop ridges, others in the floor of trenches. Observers noted gaze alignment with each soldier, adjusting with their movements, suggesting awareness without physical capability. Footprints left by the patrol did not correspond with visual impressions, creating a dissonance between perception and reality. By 1:16 a.m., the phenomenon began to dissipate. Faces blurred into fog, losing distinct features before vanishing entirely. Trenches and defensive positions collapsed into uniform gray, as if the entire tableau had been erased. The valley returned to its prior undisturbed state: fog, stone, and silence. The log concluded: visual anomaly resolved. Temporal and spatial overlay observed. No thermal, acoustic, or electromagnetic signatures detected. Personnel report disorientation and residual stress. All structures ephemeral. For a brief moment, the patrol remained motionless, cataloging the absence, aware that the valley had once again shown what it retained: Not bodies, not fire, but memory itself, preserved in a haze of fog and shadow. At 1:42 a.m., the patrol entered what was documented as a series of linear depressions, later identified as eroded trench-like passages. Initial navigation suggested a southwest progression along the valley floor, yet all measurements, GPS, pace count, and compass orientation, failed to corroborate forward movement. Repeated passes revealed identical features: a scorched signpost bearing Cyrillic markings, a collapsed ridge with identical fissures, and a burned tent fragment partially obscured by fog. The documentation officer recorded: spatial repetition confirmed. Terrain markers duplicated within $100 intervals. GPS data corrupted. Compass orientation unreliable. Personnel demonstrate increasing disorientation. Atmospheric sensors indicated stable fog density, relative humidity at 98%, and negligible wind. Despite this, visibility remained limited to 3 meters, and perception of depth was inconsistent. Archival cross-references cite similar anomalies in mountainous theaters. During Soviet operations in Nuristan, 1983, patrols reported looping terrain with identical topographical markers, resulting in mission delays and unit attrition. British reports from the Khyber Pass, 1897, describe trenches and gullies that repeat in sequence, defying orientation. By 2:03 a.m., auditory phenomena intensified. Whispered commands became increasingly intelligible, sometimes matching prior transmissions from the squad's own radio, yet delivered simultaneously from multiple directions. The soldiers reported confusion regarding both the source and content of the voices. Audio log captured multiple overlapping frequencies in the 250 to 350 range, corresponding to human speech, yet inconsistent with individual personnel. The unit's forward observer noted repeated visual anomalies within the trench passages. Apparitions of soldiers from distinct historical periods were visible simultaneously: Soviet infantry in late 20th century field uniforms, British colonial troops in khaki, and contemporary American soldiers. Each group occupied separate but overlapping spatial coordinates, moving along the trench with deliberate patterns. Thermal sensors recorded no corresponding signatures. Motion detectors indicated zero actual displacement beyond the 8-person patrol. At 2:17 a.m., the soldiers documented an environmental hazard: the perception of vertical displacement, as though the trench floor undulated independently of slope measurements. One soldier misstepped, noting that the trench floor appeared to stretch forward while receding beneath his feet. All personnel confirmed the sensation, later cross-verified with inertial sensors, which registered negligible movement. At 2:26 a.m., a significant auditory event occurred. A loud detonation reverberated through the trench system. Environmental sensors recorded a transient pressure wave, yet no physical explosive was detected. Historical correlation indicated the signature matched archival records of a 1984 Soviet patrol ambush. Identical overpressure magnitude, timing, and acoustic decay recorded in declassified after-action reports. The blast appeared to originate from multiple points along the trench simultaneously. Soldiers reported simultaneous perception of heat, smell of cordite, and shockwave vibration, although temperature and particulate sensors recorded no anomalies beyond baseline fog conditions. The detonation caused momentary panic. Soldiers attempted regrouping, shouting orders to maintain formation. Repetition of visual markers and auditory cues prevented confirmation of relative positions. Several personnel exhibited physiological responses consistent with acute fear conditioning: tachycardia, rapid shallow respiration, and increased galvanic skin response. The patrol's log concluded for the interval: trench passages exhibit repeated structural anomalies. Auditory input matches prior recorded operational incidents. Apparitions from multiple eras present concurrently. Environmental replication of detonation observed. No physical substrate detected. Personnel stress elevated. Orientation unreliable. Continued movement yields cyclical terrain repetition. The final entry noted that the valley maintained its silence immediately after the event, yet each soldier remained aware of subtle echoes, footsteps, and whispered commands, implying the loop would continue indefinitely. a spatial temporal trap resistant to conventional navigation. At 3:11 a.m., fog density reached levels sufficient to obscure all terrain beyond 2 meters. Atmospheric readings indicated relative humidity at $99%, with no detectable wind. Ambient temperature remained stable at 4, though thermal sensors registered localized fluctuations inconsistent with human presence. Personnel began reporting visual distortions. Edges of rocks and trench walls appeared to undulate, and repeated objects were perceived at varying distances. Private S, previously noted for minor disorientation, exhibited acute signs of psychological distress. Observers recorded rapid, shallow respiration exceeding 140 breaths per minute, tachycardia, and intermittent muscular tremors. Speech became fragmented and incoherent, often repeating phrases verbatim as if responding to unseen interlocutors. Eye-tracking data suggested dissociation, gaze fixated on points in fog where no measurable object existed. The documentation officer recorded, subject demonstrates acute stress response consistent with early-stage hallucinatory breakdown. Orientation compromised. Environmental input insufficient to account for perceptual phenomena. Historical comparisons were noted. Archival military case studies report similar outcomes during high-stress, low-visibility operations in mountainous theaters. Soviet patrol reports from Kunar Province, 1984, describe sudden onset of hallucinations, auditory distortion, and unit disintegration in extended fog cover. British expedition logs from the 19th century frontier describe comparable cases of visual repetition and auditory hallucinations. These phenomena were commonly associated with extreme combat fatigue, sensory deprivation, and fear conditioning. By 3:25 a.m., Private SS hallucinations intensified. He began responding to perceived commands from previous military eras, Soviet directives in Russian, British orders in English with archaic accentuation, and faint American radio chatter. Each auditory input overlapped, producing multiple, nearly simultaneous streams of speech. Attempts by squad members to redirect him were ineffective. His movements increasingly aligned with shadows and fog patterns rather than with the unit. Simultaneously, equipment readings became anomalous. Thermal imaging recorded temperatures reaching 42 in localized points along the trench, then immediately dropping below ambient baseline. Barometric sensors fluctuated by 15 hectopascals without corresponding meteorological cause. Night vision displays distorted grayscale mapping, producing repeating patterns resembling previous trench layouts observed in archival reconnaissance. Equipment anomalies correlated temporally with Private SS hallucinations but had no consistent physical explanation. At 3:42 a.m., auditory input intensified across all personnel. Hundreds of voices overlapped, emanating from the fog without identifiable origin. Linguistic analysis indicated multiple languages: Russian, Pashto, Archaic English, and Modern American English. All phrases included the soldiers' names, precise, unaltered, repeated at variable intervals. One report note: simultaneous call of multiple personnel by own names, combined with historical military syntax. No directional source identifiable. Personnel count 8. Perceived voices exceed 150. The squad exhibited synchronized physiological escalation. Pulse rates exceeded 150 bpm, respiration irregular, skin conductance elevated. Soldiers attempted to coordinate visual confirmation of voice sources, but failed. Each perceived location shifted as fog density changed. Visual and auditory inputs conflicted. Private S, detached from formation entirely, moving toward a denser section of fog where a thermal anomaly had briefly appeared. His path, though observable, did not correlate with any physical features. Attempts to physically intercept him were hindered by delayed perception and irregular motion caused by environmental distortions. The documentation officer's entry concluded: personnel experiencing total dissociation of environmental reality. Equipment readings inconsistent with physical laws. Hallucinatory input continuous, multisensory, temporally layered. Voices of prior and current military units detected, calling all personnel by name. Operational cohesion effectively null. By 3:59 a.m., the valley had achieved maximum perceptual dominance. The fog's density, Equipment anomalies and overlapping auditory hallucinations rendered standard navigation, communication, and command impossible. Every soldier's perception was mediated entirely through the valley's imposed reality, an environment simultaneously historical and immediate, infinitely layered, and fully inescapable. At 4:27 a.m., the squad initiated final radio contact with command post. The standard operating frequency was clear in previous hours, though intermittent. All previous attempts had failed due to environmental interference. The operator keyed the microphone, following procedural protocol. Command, this is Alpha Squad, Cunner Valley, over. The response was immediate but incoherent. Static surged, punctuated by overlapping voices. Each phrase carried tonal variations consistent with multiple historical periods. Soviet-accented Russian orders layered with British colonial commands from 19th century dispatches, interspersed with modern American radio chatter. The operator documented signal content unintelligible, multiple overlapping phonemes, temporal and linguistic divergence. Attempts to isolate transmission channels failed. The operator cycled through frequencies, but each produced identical distortion. Some segments of audio contained precise phonetic matches to declassified Soviet patrol communications from 1984, including last recorded directives to units that subsequently vanished without trace. Other segments mirrored British expeditionary notes from the late 1800s, repeated verbatim with timing and cadence consistent with historical recordings. At 4:34 a.m., the crew noted that the transmission began repeating fragments of their own last communications, interwoven with voices from vanished personnel. One segment played verbatim, "Lieutenant, advancing, hold position, over," followed immediately by a Soviet officer's clipped command, "Nutri, Nutri." The temporal overlay produced perceptual distortion. Every soldier reported that the messages were arriving simultaneously from every direction, though visually there was no source. The radio speaker emitted anomalous acoustic pressure. Tremors were detectable through the operator's fingers resting on the handset. The documentation officer noted, amplitude fluctuation exceeds measured output. Apparent mechanical resistance within speaker diaphragm. No external manipulation observed. Shadows in the fog responded. One elongated shape, indistinct in grayscale, extended from the tree toward the operator. Its tip intersected the radio speaker, appearing to enter the device. Thermal imaging registered nothing. No physical mass was detected. The operator instinctively recoiled, but the shadows did not retract. Observers documented, visual anomaly interacts with communication device. No physical substrate present. Apparent pull towards speaker confirmed. The fog itself seemed to pulse in synchrony with each fragment of audio. Equipment readings fluctuated unpredictably. Barometric sensors swung 12 hectopascals. Audio decibel levels spiked to 108/dB in brief intervals, yet ambient sound sensors detected no source. The overlap of auditory signals from multiple eras created continuous confusion, preventing any coherent response. By 4:42 a.m., the squad's communication attempts had fully merged with valley phenomena. Every spoken word was reflected back through the static, unaltered, and layered with historical transmissions. One fragment contained the last known words of a Soviet corporal recorded minutes before his unit disappeared. "We can't hold." The sequence repeated immediately, followed by the British colonial command, "Stand fast, men. Stand fast." The final log entry, recorded by the documentation officer, read, "All personnel accounted for visually. Environmental parameters unchanged." Radio transmission contains layered signals spanning multiple historical conflicts. Apparent interaction between shadow anomaly and communication device. Personnel report auditory feedback identical to all previously recorded last words of vanished units. Operational capability null. Valley influences maximal. Transmission ongoing, unresolved. At 4:45 a.m., the operator's microphone transmitted a low-frequency hum, and through the speaker, a single, clear voice emerged, distinct from any prior overlay. It whispered a name, one of the squad's own. The words were drawn out, deliberate, impossibly close, as if the valley itself spoke directly into the wire. No response was possible. The line went silent, except for a faint, persistent rustling, indistinguishable from the fog outside. In log, transmission incomplete. At 5:18 a.m., aerial reconnaissance recorded the valley at first light. Fog had receded to intermittent low-lying patches along the ridges, revealing terrain consistent with topographical maps, but devoid of personnel. No human activity was observed. Ground inspection confirmed these findings. All equipment belonging to the patrol remained in situ. 8 rifles leaning against rocks, backpacks partially zipped, helmets resting atop discarded field jackets. Ammunition counts were unaltered, night vision devices powered down and unaltered. No thermal or biological signatures indicated the presence of personnel. Footprints and disturbances in the soil were visible, but terminated abruptly in fog-soaked depressions. No remains, personal effects beyond issued gear, or signs of struggle were identified. The documentation officer noted, personnel unaccounted for. No evidence of removal by natural causes. Environmental readings within nominal ranges. Standard search protocols initiated. All attempts unsuccessful. Historical analysis confirmed continuity with prior conflicts. Soviet archival records from the 1980s report entire units vanishing under similar conditions. British field reports from the late 19th century describe patrols entering the valley and failing to return, leaving only equipment and scattered personal effects. Contemporary documentation aligns precisely with these accounts. The valley exhibits consistent patterns: entry, sensory anomalies, disappearance, and residual artifact retention. Villagers, previously observed near the ridge lines, maintained distance during morning reconnaissance. Interviews, conducted at a safe perimeter, reported no direct interaction but corroborated long-standing oral warnings. The valley takes its own. It never gives them back. Observers noted the villagers' gaze fixed on the valley floor, whispering in low, rhythmic cadence. The language was native, but tone suggested continuity, a warning passed across generations. No physical evidence indicated interference or extraction by external forces. Surveillance drones, infrared imaging, and ground-based sensors failed to detect movement beyond minor wildlife activity. The absence of human presence persisted across multiple observations, suggesting nonlinear temporal or spatial displacement rather than conventional abduction. Topographically, the valley remained unchanged. Ridge contours, trenches, and eroded pathways matched maps, though prior recorded anomalies, looping paths, phantom trenches, and repeated markers were consistent with archival accounts. Environmental sensors confirmed that fog density, humidity, and barometric readings were within expected early morning ranges, though isolated microclimates persisted in depressions where previous observations of visual and auditory anomalies had been recorded. The last operational note, submitted at 5:52 a.m., recorded residual anomalies, shadows observed moving independently of light sources, whispers detected on audio equipment despite environmental silence, and low-level electromagnetic readings fluctuating in intermittent bursts. No personnel returned to report firsthand. Villagers were again noted observing the valley from ridge lines. Whispered phrases indicated awareness of the patrol's disappearance, and cultural continuity suggested preparation for subsequent patrols. One remark, recorded by a local interpreter, "It will call for the next ones. They will walk in, and the valley will keep them." Final summary. All 8 patrol members remain missing. Equipment intact, no biological evidence recovered. Environmental conditions within nominal parameters, with isolated anomalous phenomena consistent with historical accounts. Valley retains all previous records of military presence. No external intervention detected. Observation indicates likelihood of repeated pattern for future patrols. At 6:07 a.m., fog began to roll back from the ridges, spilling into the valley floor. Low-angle sunlight illuminated abandoned rifles and packs, their surfaces glinting against wet soil. No figures emerged. The mist moved deliberately, filling depressions and climbing toward the cliffs, hinting at an endless cycle of occupation and disappearance. Post-incident conclusion. The valley continues to function as a site of repeated personnel loss. Pattern of disappearance consistent across multiple military campaigns. Operational caution advised for all subsequent patrols. End of report. As dawn broke over the Black Valley, All that remained were abandoned rifles, backpacks, and the lingering fog. The soldiers? Gone, vanished into history, like countless armies before them. The villagers still watch silently, whispering warnings of who the valley will claim next. If you want to uncover more hidden war zones, ghostly patrols, and untold battlefield mysteries, subscribe to Battlefield Secrets and hit the bell icon. Don't forget to like and share this video, because in these valleys, history doesn't just repeat, it waits.